Peskov is done. For weeks, rumors have swirled in the Kremlin that its main mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, won't return from vacation and might be quietly sent off as an ambassador. Insiders whisper that top propagandist Dmitry Kiselyov is being seriously considered for the position of Putin's press secretary. It seems that's why Peskov has started appearing more frequently at questionable events. But the disappearance of the main mouthpiece is just the tip of the iceberg. What other serious problems are brewing within the Russian dictator's inner circle? And what is happening to the man himself? We'll find out next.
The Kremlin is considering Dmitry Kiselyov's candidacy for the post of presidential press secretary. It seems it's no coincidence that Peskov has recently been appearing more often at rather questionable gatherings.
Putin is in a state of hysteria and paranoia. The Russian dictator is conducting one of the largest purges of his inner circle, fearing that his own associates might exploit his weakness and attempt to seize power. Moreover, tension is rising in the Kremlin over Putin's own condition. According to various reports, he is under severe stress, and his behavior increasingly shows signs of a deep internal crisis. Meanwhile, the Russian military machine continues to stall due to personnel shortages and systemic issues, despite the Kremlin's attempts to project success through propaganda. At the same time, new rumors are emerging in the information space about cracks in the power system and growing nervousness among the Russian elites, which only reinforces the sense of instability at the very top of the Kremlin. More on all this next. Watch until the end. Greetings. This is Ukraine Today. I'm Darina Hudskalo, and here are the latest events. The Kremlin dictator has finally plunged into paranoia and primal fear. As historians and analysts note, modern Russia increasingly resembles a massive repressive system where Putin exhibits behavior even harsher than Stalin's during the late period of his rule. Aware of the failures in the war against Ukraine, he is launching a wave of harsh internal repressions against his own elites. Arrests of generals, purges among oligarchs, and the persecution of former associates look like signs of a deep systemic crisis. Against this backdrop, there is more and more talk of possible upheavals within the Russian leadership itself, from an internal revolt to a palace coup which no longer seems impossible.
Russia is an empire, and empires collapse not from the outskirts, but from the center. A major political crisis and a struggle at the very top must occur. Perhaps a certain group of conspirators or disgruntled individuals will emerge who will try to remove Putin from power or isolate him, says historian Yaroslav Hrytsak. This is what happened in the final years of Stalin's life. He was very suspicious. Everyone in his circle feared that he might repress them as well. And now something similar is happening. Is Putin doing this consciously or not? Is he just irritated, or does he really have paranoia? But we see that more and more people who were his supporters and loyalists are becoming targets of persecution by the FSB.
And this colossal stress from the expectation of betrayal is already destroying the aging dictator physically. Medical experts, having analyzed Putin's recent speeches, noticed significant changes in his appearance and speech. As experts explain, due to constant nervous tension, Putin grinds his teeth heavily at night. This led to the chewing muscles becoming unnaturally enlarged, which could have changed the shape of his face.
Well, and all these whistling and hissing sounds, the general slurring of speech, plus dry mouth. A very underrated factor. Often this is a side effect of antidepressants and sleeping pills that killers take for their nerves. And there you have it, a wah across the whole hall. A small, underdeveloped lower jaw and tiny teeth didn't interest anyone, yet this is the very foundation that defines speech. With him, it's all like that. Geopolitics, the world's second army, a slack jaw, a triple wah.
As a result, the vaunted Putin facade, which Russia's best plastic surgeons worked on for years, simply collapsed. The dictator began to openly smack his lips while speaking, swallow words, and lose sounds. And it seems, seeing the leader physically fading, the generals are trying to maintain his morale as long as possible through lies. The military continues to feed him with fabricated victories. The cunning chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, reports mythical successes to Putin twice a day, effectively manipulating him into believing that time is on Russia's side. Although in reality, the occupiers have a huge number of problems in the war against Ukraine, and there have been no real successes in recent months. This and more was reported by Financial Times journalists.
Western intelligence told the publication that production has plateaued in almost all areas except for drones and long-range weapons, where the Kremlin is now directing maximum resources. This is already noticeable at the front. According to Blackbird Group analysts, from February to May, Russia captured 164 square kilometers, compared to 1,151 square kilometers in the same period last year. Ukrainian drones are striking logistics, airfields, convoys, and oil refineries, gradually eating away at the Russian advantage in manpower and artillery. At the same time, Putin, as former Kremlin officials say, is still confident that victory is only a matter of time.
And while Putin tries to hold on to power, the Russian information space is already openly losing its mind from the humiliations. Enraged by the fleet's loss and Crimea's blockade, Z-bloggers have gone off the rails, demanding Navy Commander Alexander Moiseev answer for his words or self-liquidate.
Indeed, why not ensure the supply of Crimea by sea? This is ours. And anyone who says otherwise is a slanderer. We don't need any backups. There are no tasks. Well, there are tasks. The Americans ran convoys across the Atlantic. Can't the honorable man in the photo organize convoys in this Black Sea puddle? He can, right? In short, it's time to answer for your words and actions over the last 5 years or for...
Meanwhile, a massive scandal has erupted in the capital itself. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin has suddenly betrayed his boss. Over 500 messages appeared on his official Telegram channel with slogans like "Glory to Ukraine," threats that Moscow will burn, and direct calls to donate to the AFU. The posts were deleted after 15 minutes, but the terrified mayor's office couldn't come up with any explanation. How did this happen so suddenly? But these are far from all of Russia's problems. A colossal blow to the Kremlin's gas station. Ukraine's long-range attacks have knocked out over 20% of Russian oil refining capacity, sparking the largest fuel crisis since the invasion began. Now, at gas stations in Russia, there's either no gas at all, or it's being rationed with strict limits of up to 20 liters per person. Watch all the details of the fuel collapse right now.
Putin has finally fought himself into a corner. The fuel crisis has reached the very heart of Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. In a country that for decades called itself an energy superpower, gas stations have suddenly started imposing limits on gasoline and diesel. Now, fuel is being released to drivers almost like a scarce commodity. No more than 20 liters of gas and 40 liters of diesel per person. The irony is that this isn't happening in some remote area, but in Russia's two main cities. The reaction of officials is even more interesting. The authorities traditionally insist there's no shortage and that supplies are sufficient. However, if there's truly enough fuel, then why limit its sale? It seems the Russian bureaucracy has once again invented its own version of reality, where empty tanks are called stable supplies and gas station limits are called an absence of problems. Not long ago, Russian propaganda mocked Ukrainian fuel lines. Now, similar problems are hitting Russia itself, from Moscow and Petersburg to Rostov, Kazan, Kursk, and Volgograd. And while the Kremlin keeps talking about the strength of its economy, in practice, a country with some of the world's largest oil reserves is suddenly rationing gas. It looks as if the main enemy of the Russian fuel industry is no longer sanctions, but the consequences of its own war. The disaster also hit Tatarstan, one of Russia's main oil regions, which ranks second in oil production and is among the leaders in refining. There, good drones struck the Taniko and Taif NK oil refineries. The country's fuel market is largely supplied from there. So when problems start at the very heart of Russian oil refining, it's no wonder the consequences quickly reach even Moscow and Petersburg. It's turning out quite awkward. Strikes are hitting hundreds of kilometers from the capital, but fuel limits are already being set near the Kremlin. The behavior of the oil giants themselves adds a particular sense of irony to the situation. Not long ago, they were insisting there were no problems at all, and any talk of a shortage was an exaggeration. But reality proved to be stubborn. First, restrictions began appearing in the Moscow region, then in New Moscow, and now they've reached the country's largest cities. It seems like the Russian authorities are trying to convince the public that there's no fire while they're running around the house with buckets. The regions that are supposed to feed the entire country have also been affected. In the Irkutsk region, farmers are already openly talking about the threat of bankruptcy. There's a diesel shortage, prices have soared to record levels, and in some places, field work is simply grinding to a halt. The Buretsky farm has already been forced to suspend its operations due to a lack of fuel. Imagine that. An energy superpower cannot even refuel its own tractors. The problem has become so serious that local farmers are being told to refuel heavy agricultural machinery at regular gas stations. It sounds almost like a joke, but these are exactly the kinds of ideas coming from officials right now. However, farmers can only shrug their shoulders. Huge combines and tractors simply cannot operate under such schemes. And while officials invent new ways to fight reality, diesel has nearly doubled in price since February, exceeding 100,000 rubles per ton. And the most interesting thing is that this is no longer just a local story. Diesel shortages and fuel sales restrictions are being recorded in at least 25 regions of the Russian Federation. Krasnoyarsk Krai, Rostov region, Krasnodar Krai, the list is constantly growing. Farmers complain that they can't buy fuel even at sky-high prices, and delivery times have turned into a total lottery. And while the Kremlin spends huge resources on the war, its own agricultural sector is beginning to suffocate from a resource shortage. However, while fuel limits are just starting in Russia, the situation in occupied Crimea looks much bleaker. There, gasoline is turning into a strategic resource. Local residents stand in lines at gas stations for hours, but even that doesn't guarantee success. Because as soon as a fuel truck arrives at the station, the Russian military are often the first to get the fuel. The occupying army, which supposedly controls the peninsula, is now taking resources before the civilian population. Against this backdrop, what usually accompanies any shortage is beginning to flourish in Crimea: the black market. Fuel is resold through intermediaries or even straight from fuel trucks, but at a price 2 to 3 times higher than the official one. It seems the peninsula is gradually returning to the wild 90s, where goods can only be found through connections and for a lot more money. Most tellingly, the occupation authorities are already being forced to introduce strict control methods. A QR code system has appeared in Sevastopol, and a limit of only 20 liters of fuel per day has been set for each car. Officials and controllers are on duty near gas stations, making sure that drivers do not buy gasoline repeatedly. The irony is that all this is happening in a territory that the Kremlin has for years shown as a showcase of its successful integration. The reason for such problems is becoming increasingly obvious. After a series of strikes on military logistics and fuel infrastructure, the occupiers can no longer rely on large stockpiles as before. Every strike on logistics, every damaged route, and every supply disruption immediately results in queues at gas stations. It seems the fuel crisis, which began as a local problem, is gradually turning into another headache for the Kremlin. The most unpleasant thing for Russia is that this no longer looks like a temporary glitch. If a country that called itself an energy superpower is forced to ration gasoline, then a logical question arises: what will happen next? It seems that Ukrainian strikes are increasingly hitting not only individual plants, but also the very myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources. And this myth is starting to melt faster than gasoline at Russian gas stations. Putin has lost control. The smell of crisis is growing stronger in the Kremlin. And the most interesting thing is that it's no longer the opposition or Western experts who are sounding the alarm, but people from within the Russian system itself. While propaganda continues to talk about stability and unity, Russian deputies have openly begun to speak about corruption, the risk of mass unrest, and growing public dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, economic problems, Ukrainian drone strikes, internet outages, and new sanctions only increase the pressure on the Kremlin. It seems it's becoming increasingly difficult for Putin's government to hide the real state of affairs, and the cracks in the facade of the unshakable fortress are becoming so noticeable that they are already seen even within the Russian government itself. More on this in detail next. Putin is already one step away from collapse. The smell of crisis in the Kremlin is becoming more distinct. And this time, it's not the opposition sounding the alarm at all. Even in the Russian State Duma, it's becoming harder to hide the nervousness. CPRF Deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion. According to him, the time of illusions is over, and the responsibility for possible chaos will fall entirely on the current government. For a system where officials have competed for years in loyalty to Putin, such statements sound like a rather alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another deputy, communist Rinat Suleimanov, who previously called for the war to end as soon as possible, joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, an uncomfortable question is being asked more and more often: how much longer can Russia withstand this war? The reasons for dissatisfaction are piling up one after another. Mass internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are hitting the public mood harder and harder. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to speak openly about the fact that dangerous social pressure is building up under the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence on the internal situation in Russia came as a total shock to Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence obtained documents on the real internal political state of Russia, the very same reports that land directly on Putin's desk. And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite bleak.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without any embellishments. But even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for certain conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing even before the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually sagging, creating an awkward dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why things are getting worse, or once again perform miracles of electoral math. Equally alarming for Moscow is the rise of protest sentiments in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when accumulated discontent might erupt. Especially considering that summer is still ahead with its economic problems, logistics strikes, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe these reports don't even account for potential events in June, July, and August, which will inevitably impact the situation in Russia further.
And this is where it gets most interesting. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to continue increasing pressure on Russia, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. This means that for the Kremlin, the most difficult months may still lie ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems pile up, ratings drop, and drones strike all at once, even the strongest propaganda starts to fail.
The perfectly justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and will increase. And not just our pressure. So, by September, Putin will emerge with even significantly worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's stability, Ukraine increasingly shows a different image of a Kremlin losing control and forced to constantly put out new crises. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of bad luck. Fuel problems in a country that for decades boasted of its energy superpower status, logistics strikes, attacks on strategic sites, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin still talks about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not just on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply cannot adapt to in time. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion lasts, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts lagging behind events, every new problem automatically spawns several more. That is why, ahead of the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and a new sanctions package, Kyiv is actively pushing a simple message to its Western partners. Russia no longer looks like the side that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs show that the Kremlin's resources are being drained faster than they can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in those who can win, rather than in those who try to explain away their problems with more propaganda fairy tales. And the most unpleasant part for Moscow is that problems are piling up from several sides at once. A new package of EU sanctions, more pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian long-range strike campaign. While the Kremlin recently sold the world an image of an invulnerable fortress, today that image looks more like a building facade where cracks are visible even from afar. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a total collapse. And as always, tight-lipped and 30 seconds of shame, Putin is still silent about Ukraine's massive strike on the Moscow oil refinery. While social media exploded with videos of a burning Kapotnya, official pro-Kremlin media gave this historic disaster only 30 seconds of airtime. And the Kremlin traditionally lied about the high efficiency of the air defenses. Watch for more details.
Another one's coming. Why are they bombing us?
Muscovites have lost their minds. The capital of the Russian Federation has experienced its worst nightmare of the entire war. What the Russian authorities try to present as another successful air defense operation looks more like a chronicle of the systemic vulnerability of the Russian capital itself. According to official statements, nearly 200 drones were headed for Moscow and the surrounding region. If shooting down this many targets requires closing roads, stopping operations, and putting out new fires, an awkward question arises. Is everything really under control? The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya took the brunt of the retaliatory fire. The facility has come under attack for the second time in a week. And this happened just as the plant was preparing to resume operations after the previous attack. While Russian officials report hundreds of supposedly destroyed drones, a key fuel infrastructure site is burning again and making headlines. In Moscow, there's total chaos, closed highways, traffic restrictions, fires in shopping centers, and nervous reports from officials. The capital, long portrayed as the safest place in Russia, increasingly resembles a city living under constant air raid alerts. The war the Kremlin once promised to fight far away is increasingly coming right to the doorsteps of Russians themselves. Following the drones, missiles were also headed for Moscow. It was likely a Bars. It's a high-speed aircraft-type vehicle with a small turbojet engine and a warhead weighing roughly 50 to 100 kilograms. This combination allows it not only to cover long distances, but also to create serious problems for the enemy's air defense systems. The strike range is also surprising. According to available info, the Bars can operate at a distance of about 700 to 800 kilometers. So we're talking about a so-called middle strike class of weapon that allows for systematic hits on warehouses, headquarters, oil depots, logistics hubs, and other vital targets far behind the front lines. But the biggest blow to Moscow wasn't dealt by drones, but by reality. After the drone attack, Russian social media literally exploded with panic, sarcasm, and awkward questions. And while propaganda once again spoke of successfully downed targets, Russians themselves suddenly began recalling things the Kremlin would rather have long forgotten. Comments about the legendary Kyiv in 3 days were particularly painful for Russian propaganda. Internet users are openly mocking the loud promises made at the start of the war. After new explosions and fires in the capital, more and more Russians are asking a simple question. If everything is going according to plan, why, in the 4th year of the war, are drones regularly visiting Moscow itself? Russians are genuinely surprised by the number of Ukrainian drones. Where do they get so many drones if we've been told for years that all factories, warehouses, and production sites were destroyed long ago? Indeed, when propaganda lives in its own fictional reality for too long, sooner or later it starts arguing with itself. The master of the Kremlin himself also got some heat. Will the bunker grandpa see this fire? These are exactly the kind of sarcastic questions aimed at Putin online. It seems Russians are no longer as concerned with official stats on downed drones as they are with why explosions and fires are becoming a routine part of their lives. Meanwhile, Ukrainians aren't lagging behind on the internet either. The roof of a storage tank suddenly became the real star of the attack. After the strike on the Moscow refinery, one of the fuel tanks experienced such a powerful detonation that its top part was literally tossed high into the air. The footage instantly spread across social media and was immediately turned into memes. Users poured all their imagination into dozens of brilliant jokes, from UFOs to explosion smoke tipping its hat to the AFU. There were also parodies of legendary viral images. Sometimes one lucky shot deals as much of a blow to the reputation of Russian propaganda as the attack itself. Because while officials try to convince everyone that nothing serious happened, the internet has already turned the event into the main meme of the day. The capital of the Russian Federation now lives in a state of constant anxiety. Drones arrive, refineries burn, transport stops, and official reports increasingly sound like an attempt to explain the unexplainable. The Kremlin talks about control. Moscow sees smoke and closed roads. And between these two realities, the gap only grows. What do you think about these events? Write your opinion in the comments. Give it a like and stay informed about the main news. More to come. See you!